Sometimes what we fear the most is exactly what we need to heal. The snow was falling hard that night. She thought she was alone. A woman hiding from grief in a remote cabin, wrapped in silence and snowdrifts. But then, golden eyes appeared from the tree line. A wild creature, a predator. Not there to attack, but to stay. What started as survival became something no one could have predicted. This isn't a story of a woman saving a bobcat. It's the story of how a bobcat saved her. And what happened deep in the winter woods of Minnesota will change the way you think about fear, healing, and connection, buried in snow and silence. Grief doesn't knock. It moves in and waits for you to break. Lena Marshall hadn't planned to stay long in Ely, Minnesota. But grief is a strange kind of squatter. It doesn't follow maps, and it certainly doesn't care about plans. After losing her younger brother Tyler in a freak skiing accident the winter before, Lena's world had collapsed inward like a dying star. Every noise, every question, every sympathy card felt like glass in her chest. So she did what broken people sometimes do. She ran away from everything, to nowhere, to stillness, to a little wooden cabin outside Ely, tucked between frozen lakes and pine forests, where the only sounds were wind and snow, and her own thoughts gnawing at her like wolves. She arrived in early December, just before the first blizzard of the season. The cabin sat on a hill off Highway 169, 5 miles from town, and buried under 3 feet of snow by the end of her first week. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, a narrow cot, and one old rocking chair that groaned every time she sat down. No Wi-Fi, no TV. Just her cameras, her notebooks, and the cold. Exactly what she thought she wanted. She filled her days walking the snowy trails with her Nikon strapped around her neck, gloves fingerless for better grip. Her hands always numb, but she never minded. The pain reminded her she was still there, still breathing. She snapped photos of icicles, deer tracks, snow-capped birches, and never, not once, of people. Lena wasn't hiding from the world so much as pretending it didn't exist. Inside, she lit firewood and boiled tea she never drank. She kept the thermostat low, blaming the budget, but really because warmth made her restless. Cold was a better match for what was inside her. She avoided the townspeople, kind enough folks, but they asked too many questions. And she had no interest in their kindness. Not when every good memory came wrapped in the face of someone she'd lost. At night, she'd lie awake listening to the roof creak under snow weight, sometimes hearing branches snap in the woods beyond the porch, the kind of sound that makes city people uneasy. But she wasn't afraid, not of bears, not of wolves, not even of dying alone in a winter storm. What scared her was waking up to another day exactly like the last. Another day without Tyler. Then one afternoon, while scouting frozen creek beds with her telephoto lens, she saw movement in the trees. Not a squirrel, not a deer. Lena raised her camera, adjusting the focus, and her breath caught. A bobcat, standing in the snow not 50 feet away. It wasn't hunting or hiding. It was watching her. And she was watching it. A quiet standoff in the woods. One soul frozen by loss, one by pain, and neither one running. Not yet. Eyes in the snow. Sometimes the wild sees you before you're ready to be found. Lena didn't move. Not even a breath. The bobcat stood just beyond the tree line, its paws buried in a thick carpet of snow, steam curling from its nostrils with every slow exhale. The light from the setting sun broke through the branches, casting golden threads across its fur. She could see now, clearly, that it was a male, maybe 2 years old. Not fully grown, but not young either. Its coat was a dappled mix of grays, browns, and rust, with distinctive black spots along its sides and thick tufts at the tips of its ears. A short bob tail flicked once, slow and deliberate, and then a detail that made Lena's stomach turn gently. The back right leg was injured, not broken, but weak, a limp, subtle but certain. It shifted its weight, favoring the front paws, but still stood with quiet defiance. That was the first moment she noticed the eyes, deep amber, burning through the cold air like two tiny fires. It wasn't just looking, it was studying her, as if trying to decide whether she was threat, prey, or something else entirely. The lens in her hand felt suddenly irrelevant. She didn't raise it, didn't dare break the connection. She just stared. She wasn't afraid. Oddly, in that frozen clearing, Lena felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not awe, something warmer. Recognition. It reminded her of how Tyler used to look at her when they were kids, like she was the only person who could fix things. That same silent plea hidden beneath layers of strength. Eventually, the bobcat blinked, then turned its head slightly as if making a choice. Not to attack, not to flee, but to stay. Only for a second longer. Then, with a graceful step, it moved back into the forest, vanishing into the brush like smoke in wind. Gone. Lena stood in place long after it disappeared. The woods grew quiet again, but not empty. Something had changed. Something in her chest, tight for months, loosened just enough to let air in. She walked back to the cabin in silence. Didn't look through the photos she'd taken that day. She didn't need to. The image was already seared into her memory. Later that night, she stood at the window, looking out into the darkened trees. Nothing but wind and falling snow. But she left the porch light on. Not for herself. For him. For the bobcat. She didn't know why. Maybe it was hope. Maybe instinct. But somewhere deep down, Lena knew that wasn't the last time she'd see him. And next time, she wouldn't just be the one watching. The storm that brought him back. When the cold presses in, even the wild must choose who it trusts. The wind began to howl just after midnight. Lena had been up, restlessly shifting in bed, the memory of those golden eyes still vivid behind her closed lids. She didn't know what she was waiting for until the first gust slammed against the cabin like a freight train. The blizzard had arrived. Within an hour, the trees groaned under the weight of snow and wind, branches cracking like rifle shots through the forest. White swallowed the world, piling against the cabin walls, erasing every trail she'd followed just that morning. She lost power by dawn. No light, no heat, except for the fireplace she now fed like a baby bird. Every few hours, more wood, more breath, more prayers. It wasn't her first northern storm, but it was by far the worst. And most terrifying of all, it was silent. That kind of cold doesn't make noise, it waits. Lena wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, her camera gear shoved aside for the first time in weeks. She sat by the window, watching as the snow rose past the porch steps, trapped, alone, until a shape moved. Barely noticeable, just a twitch of contrast in the sea of white. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks. But no. There, cutting through the storm, limping but steady, came the bobcat. He made his way across the clearing with his head low, his paws sinking deep with each step. And then he stopped, right at her front door. For a full minute, he didn't move. Neither did she. He just stood there, his body hunched against the cold, as if waiting for something. Or someone. Lena's breath caught. What do I do? Open the door to a wild predator in the middle of a blizzard? Was she crazy? She stared through the frosted glass. He wasn't snarling, wasn't baring teeth. He was just there, shivering. Lena grabbed her coat, fingers fumbling against the buttons, heart hammering. She opened the door slowly, just a crack. The wind howled in like a scream. The bobcat didn't move. His eyes met hers again, just as steady as that first time. She didn't speak, didn't try to lure him in. She just opened the door wider, backed away, and waited. For several seconds, the animal didn't budge. Then one paw lifted, then another. He stepped across the threshold. Into the cabin, into the warmth. Snow dripped from his fur. He looked smaller now, hunched and hollow. He moved slowly, cautiously, each step deliberate. But he didn't hiss, didn't growl. Instead, he lay down just inside the entryway, his sides rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. Lena didn't approach. She sat back by the fire, watching him from 10 feet away. A silent agreement hung between them. This is shelter, not ownership. Safety, not control. She placed a bowl of water near the wall, some venison jerky beside it. He didn't eat immediately, just closed his eyes and rested. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that tiny wooden cabin, 2 survivors, one human, one wild, shared the silence. And for the first time in months, Lena didn't feel quite so alone. The quiet pact. Trust isn't born in noise. It's built in the hush between heartbeats. The storm didn't let up for 2 more days. White winds screamed across the trees while the world outside disappeared under 6-foot drifts. But inside the cabin, time slowed. Each hour was marked not by clocks, but by the subtle rhythm of survival. Feeding the fire, melting snow for water, listening to the wind moan through the eaves. And always the Bobcat. He stayed curled near the door, his mottled coat steaming lightly as the cabin's warmth soaked into him. He never ventured further than a few feet inside, never explored, never approached, but he also never left. The jerky remained untouched for hours. Then, in the early hours of the second morning, it vanished. So did the water. Lena didn't say a word, didn't move toward him. She simply left more. Each offering placed gently, slowly, on a wool mat near the wall. No sudden movements, no expectations, just presence. By the third morning, the worst of the blizzard had passed. Sunlight glinted through the frost-laced windows, revealing a forest blanketed in untouched white. A stillness so complete, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Lena stood at the window for a long time, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the aftermath. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something strange. A pull, like the Bobcat had brought more than just himself through her door. He'd brought a silence she could live with. That afternoon, he moved. Limping, slow, but graceful as ever, he padded deeper into the cabin. Not far, just a few steps. But Lena noticed. It felt like the shift in a dance. One step closer, one veil lifted. That night, she lit the fire early. The Bobcat didn't wait by the door. He found a place near the hearth, curling tightly into himself. Still distant, still wild, but no longer on guard. She sat in the rocking chair across from him, sipping from a chipped mug of lukewarm tea. She didn't speak, didn't try to name him. He wasn't a pet, he wasn't hers, he was company, and that was enough. In the glow of the fire, his eyes flickered open now and then, scanning her silhouette. Curious, unthreatened, Lena found herself breathing differently, slower, deeper. For the first time since Tyler's death, her chest didn't ache with every inhale. It was as if some small, frozen part of her had begun to thaw. Because someone was watching. Because someone stayed. That night, when the wind picked up again, she dreamed not of snow or silence or grief, but of golden eyes in a forest of white. And when she woke, the Bobcat was still there. Still breathing, still keeping watch. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was trust. A fragile thread spun between 2 souls, both a little lost. Both quietly choosing, day by day, not to run. Shadows in the firelight. The body can rest, but grief remembers everything. That night, the past came knocking. Lena woke in the dark, sweat clinging to her neck, heart galloping like she'd been running through a war zone. But there were no footsteps, no screams, just the soft crackle of dying embers and the hush of winter pressing against the windows. She sat up slowly, breath shaky, and rubbed her face with cold palms. The dream had been so real. She was back on the mountain, Tyler shouting ahead of her, snow spraying from his skis as he carved down the slope. Then silence. Then the sight of his crumpled body, twisted near the tree line. The last thing she ever saw before the rescue team pulled her away. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in nearly a year, and now it echoed in her head like a bell she couldn't unring. Lena leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and tried to ground herself in the present. She was in Ely. It was February, Tyler was gone, but she wasn't alone. The Bobcat had shifted in the dark. He was sitting up, muscles taut, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight, like coins dropped into deep water. He was watching her, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something else. Attention, readiness, as if her anguish had summoned him. She didn't speak, didn't dare. She just held his gaze, letting the tears fall in silence. And he stayed like that for minutes, motionless, unwavering, present. When her sobs finally subsided, she lay back down, pulse still raw in her ears. The Bobcat stretched once, then curled closer to the hearth again, this time just a few feet nearer. Lena didn't fall asleep right away. She just listened to the fire, to the wind, and to the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. The storm had passed, but something deeper had been stirred. Not danger, not panic, just the raw memory of loss, and the quiet reassurance that someone was there to bear witness. She didn't need comfort, she needed to be seen. And the wild creature at her feet had done exactly that. The cold inside. Sometimes the real storm brews beneath the skin. The sun was weak that morning, peeking through the trees like it was too tired to rise. Lena bundled up for a short hike, just a mile or two to photograph the ice-frozen lake bed she'd been watching all winter. The Bobcat stayed behind, curled in his usual spot, blinking lazily as she stepped into the snow. She didn't feel the chill at first. Her body moved on habit, boots crunching, camera snug against her chest, the trail carved like muscle memory. But halfway back, something shifted. Her legs felt heavy, her skin burned under her jacket, and her vision blurred at the edges like frost creeping across glass. She stumbled once, then twice. By the time she saw the cabin through the trees, it swayed like a ghost house in fog. Her knees buckled just steps from the porch. She hit the snow hard, her breath shallow, ears ringing. Flu? Exhaustion? Pneumonia? She didn't know, didn't have time to wonder. The sky above her spun. Her last thought before blacking out was the ridiculous image of the Bobcat, looking unimpressed with her dramatic collapse. She expected cold, silence, nothing. But instead, warmth found her. A rough tongue brushed her cheek. Heavy fur pressed against her side. She blinked through the haze and saw him, the Bobcat, circling, whining, not growling, but making strange, guttural noises from deep in his chest. She couldn't move, could barely whisper, but he didn't leave, didn't run. Instead, he paced. Back and forth to the porch, to the tree line, and back to her again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, until a distant voice cracked through the woods. "Lena!" A man, then boots crunching fast. Arms lifting her, a blanket, heat, darkness. When she woke in a clinic bed 2 days later, the nurse told her a forest ranger had found her collapsed in the snow. "Lucky break," he said. "Trail was buried, but fresh Bobcat tracks led straight to you." The ranger had followed those prints without question. They'd ended right at her body. No one could explain it. No one needed to. Lena just closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the nurse, not to the ranger, but to the creature that had refused to leave her behind. Tracks in the snow. Sometimes the wild leaves a trail for the broken to be found. The ranger hadn't planned to check on Lena that day. But something had tugged at him. A voicemail from the local store, saying she hadn't picked up supplies in over a week. She wasn't the kind to skip errands, so he geared up, snowshoes strapped tight, and made the long trek toward her cabin through the powder-crushed trail. The air was sharp and brittle, the kind that stung the lungs. As he approached the clearing, he saw her SUV half buried in snow. No smoke from the chimney, no footprints near the door. But something else caught his eye. Tracks, fresh ones. Four-toed paw prints, deep and steady, pacing between the edge of the woods and a shallow drift by the porch. Bobcat. And they weren't wandering, they were circling, moving with intention. His instincts kicked in. He followed the tracks into the woods. 200 feet in, his breath caught. There she was, collapsed, curled like a broken branch in the snow. Face pale, fingertips blue. Beside her, paw prints, and the unmistakable indent where something warm had lain against her body, as if trying to keep her from freezing. He radioed the clinic, wrapped her in a spare parka, and carried her back. He never saw the Bobcat. But he didn't need to. He'd seen the trail. He'd followed it, and it had led him to her. Later, the doctor said Lena had been hours from hypothermia taking her. One more gust of wind, one less layer. She wouldn't have made it. The ranger didn't tell anyone what he suspected. They'd laugh, say it was a coincidence. But as he stood on her porch 2 days later, dropping off her keys, he noticed something odd. Near the trees, half buried in white. The Bobcat, sitting still, watching. Not frightened, not running, just watching. The ranger tipped his hat and said quietly, "Thanks." The Bobcat blinked once, then turned and vanished into the snow, the space between them. Sometimes, goodbye isn't a moment. It's a look, held long enough to heal. 3 weeks later, Lena returned to the cabin. The clinic had insisted she stay longer, but she couldn't. Not while wondering. Not while feeling something unfinished pressed against her chest like snow that refused to melt. The drive was slow. Ice clung to the trees like crystal fingers, and the road twisted like a memory she didn't want to revisit. But she did, because she had to, because something had waited for her, and she needed to know if it still was. When she stepped onto the porch, the wind was gentle for once. The door opened with a sigh of cold air, but the room was just as she left it. Blankets rumpled near the fire, her camera bag still sitting beneath the window. And in the corner, an empty spot where warmth had once curled up and watched her sleep. She didn't expect him to be there. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to be, but she waited. 3 days passed. She walked her usual paths, found the snow thinner now, the silence less hostile. She still couldn't bring herself to photograph the land again. It wasn't ready. She wasn't either. Then, on the 4th morning, while standing by the old maple near the frozen creek, she felt it. That stillness. Not the cold. The presence. She turned. And there he was, perched on a small rise just beyond the tree line. Not moving. Not approaching, watching. The Bobcat looked different now. Stronger. The limp was gone. Or almost gone. And his fur was full and glossy. The winter sunlight catching every fleck of rust and gold like fire woven into his pelt. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, and neither did she. Lena stepped forward slowly, not to close the distance, but to honor it. Because something had passed between them during those quiet days of survival. A wordless pact, one that didn't need taming or touch, only trust. "I'm okay," she whispered, voice steady. She wasn't sure if it was for him or herself, maybe both. The Bobcat blinked once, almost lazily. Then, with the same quiet dignity he'd always carried, he turned away, slipping between the trees, leaving only paw prints behind. Lena didn't follow. She stayed there, heart full of something that wasn't quite grief anymore, something more whole. She returned to the cabin and packed slowly, carefully. There would be no more hiding here. She had healing to do, and it wouldn't come from isolation. it would come from sharing. That night, before leaving for town, she set a small wooden carving on the porch, a bobcat, rough and simple, carved from pine. A tribute, a thank you. Not for being saved, but for being seen, the wild that heals. Some stories aren't meant to be told with words, but with silence, eyes, and snow. Back in town, Lena didn't disappear again. Not this time. She rented a small studio above the old bookstore in Ellie, where the windows overlooked the white roofs of the village and the edge of the forest that had once swallowed her whole. The cabin remained, but it was no longer her sanctuary. It was a chapter, one she could revisit, but no longer needed to live inside. She spent the first week organizing her photos, not just the ones from the last storm, but everything she'd taken since arriving. And more importantly, the ones she hadn't taken, because something had changed in her. Her camera no longer felt like a shield. It became a key, a way in, not to hide behind, but to reach through. She called the project The Wild That Heals, a photo series of untouched winter, quiet creatures, and the soft spaces between fear and trust. There were no pose shots, no explanations, just moments. She developed the images herself, hours spent in her small darkroom, breathing in the scent of chemicals and hope. The photo of the bobcat never existed, at least not in her camera. She'd never taken it, but she didn't need to. Instead, she painted his presence into her series in other ways. A paw print captured perfectly in fresh snow, a set of eyes reflected in the dark window of the cabin, an empty space beside the fire where no one sat, but something had been. Each image told a piece of a truth no one could question. People came slowly at first. Locals wandered into the gallery when it opened, then travelers, then journalists. A nature magazine picked up her story, minus the details, of course. She kept the rescue quiet. What mattered wasn't the miracle. It was the message. That healing doesn't always come from humans. That wild things can sometimes teach us more than therapists or textbooks. That presence can save a life. Lena gave talks, short ones, still soft-spoken, but filled with conviction. She never used the word bobcat. She didn't have to. She talked about trust, about how silence doesn't always mean emptiness, about how survival is sometimes as simple as lying beside a fire and refusing to leave. The community responded. Art students asked to shadow her. Photographers sent letters from across the country, moved by the emotion in her work. And in the back of every talk, every exhibit, every published page was him. The wild thing that hadn't been saved. The wild thing that had saved her. Legacy in the forest. To honor the wild is to never try to own it, only to listen when it chooses to speak. Spring crept slowly into Ely that year. Snow melted in soft, uneven patches across the hills, and the rivers began to hum again with a steady trickle that sounded like breathing. Lena spent most of her days between the studio and the forest's edge. She didn't stray deep anymore. Not because she feared it, but because she'd found her place on the threshold. 1 foot in the wild, 1 foot in the world. That was enough. And it was from that place, in between, that she decided to create something more permanent. She reached out to the local wildlife center, a small, underfunded group of conservationists who had been rescuing injured animals in northern Minnesota for years. She told them she wanted to help, not just with money, but with purpose. She donated a portion of her gallery's earnings to expand their facilities. But more than that, she gave them a name, the Tyler Project, a tribute not only to her brother, but to the idea that no life, human or animal, should go unseen. She gave talks at local schools, sharing stories not of tragedy, but of connection. She showed children how to track animals by their footprints, how to listen for movement in silence, how to respect a creature's space without needing to touch it. They listened, and the forest felt fuller because of it. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, The night she nearly didn't survive, Lena returned to the cabin one last time. Not to stay, not to remember, but to honor. She brought with her a weatherproof box carved from cedar. Inside it, she placed a single photo, the paw print in the snow, captured just feet from where she'd collapsed. Alongside it, she left a short note, written by hand. It read, "You saved me without knowing my name. I remember you without needing yours." She sealed the box and buried it beneath the old maple tree near the frozen creek, the same place she'd seen him last. No ceremony, no final words, just the rustle of leaves returning to life and the gentle drip of melting snow. As she turned to go, movement caught her eye. Up on the ridge, just where the trees broke into open sky, stood a shape. Slender, silent, familiar. It was another bobcat, or maybe the same one, she couldn't be sure. It stood still for a long moment, tail twitching once, ears lifted in that poised, timeless way. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Lena didn't call out, didn't follow. She just smiled. The kind of smile that comes when something lost has finally come full circle. She walked back to her truck, leaving the cabin, the ridge, the memory behind. But the legacy, that would stay. In every child who learned to love without touching. In every rescue made possible by a quiet photo taken in winter. And in the still places of the forest where trust once lingered between a woman and a wild thing. Both broken, both brave, both forever changed. Sometimes, the most powerful healing doesn't come from words, therapy, or even other people. It comes from being seen when we think we are invisible, from feeling safe in the presence of something that asks nothing of us. Lena didn't tame the bobcat, and he never stayed because he had to. He chose to. And in that choice, something unspoken bloomed: trust. In life, we often run from the wild parts of ourselves, the grief, the fear, the silence. But maybe it's in that wilderness where we're finally found. The story of Lena and the bobcat reminds us to honor the quiet connections, the presence of something that simply stays, and the courage it takes to do the same for someone else. Whether it's a friend, a stranger, or a creature that never says a word, healing begins when we learn to see, not just be seen. At Paw Prints and Stories, we share these emotional bonds between animals and people to remind you, you are never truly alone in the wild. So here's your challenge. The next time someone seems lost in their own storm, don't try to fix them. Just stay. Be the stillness beside their fire